What happens when a high-powered mogul forces a man from the streets into the world of the 1%? This isn't just a fake relationship, it's a high-stakes social experiment designed to fool the world's most rigid parents. As the masks fall away, they both discover that the most authentic connection often starts with a total deception. The rain hammered against the corrugated metal roof of the garage, a relentless rhythmic drumming that seemed to count down the seconds Elias had left before the bank took everything. He stood under the flickering fluorescent hum of his small shop, his hands stained with the indelible ink of engine oil and hard labor. At 32, his face bore the map of a man who had lived twice that long, with creases around his eyes carved by late nights and the constant, gnawing anxiety of a father who was failing to keep his head above water. In the corner of the grease-scented room, his 6-year-old daughter Mia sat on a milk crate, meticulously coloring a picture of a castle with a crayon that was little more than a nub. She was his entire world, the only reason he kept his back straight when the weight of the world tried to buckle his knees. But a stack of pink eviction notices sat on his workbench, weighted down by a heavy wrench, a silent testament to the fact that love didn't pay the light bill or the soaring costs of the medical treatments Mia needed for her chronic asthma. The sound of a high-performance engine, smooth and purring like a predatory cat, cut through the noise of the storm. A sleek, midnight black sedan pulled into the gravel lot, its headlights cutting through the gloom like twin sabers. Elias wiped his hands on a rag that was more grease and cloth, watching as a woman stepped out from the back seat. She looked like she belonged on the cover of a magazine, not in a dying neighborhood on the edge of the city. Elena Sterling moved with a cold, calculated grace, her designer heels clicking sharply against the oil-stained concrete. She carried an aura of absolute authority, the kind that came from overseeing a multi-billion-dollar shipping empire. Yet her eyes held a frantic, trapped quality that Elias recognized instantly. It was the look of someone backed into a corner, even if that corner was made of gold. "Mr. Elias Thorne?" she asked, her voice cutting through the damp air with the precision of a scalpel. She didn't wait for a confirmation. She knew exactly who he was. Elena didn't offer a handshake or a greeting. Instead, she laid a thick, cream-colored folder onto his workbench, right next to the eviction notices. She spoke of an ultimatum, a traditionalist father who controlled the board of her company, and a mother who viewed Elena's single status as a stain on the family legacy. To keep her position as CEO, she needed a partner for the upcoming Sterling Centennial Gala, someone who wouldn't be recognized by her social circle but possessed the raw potential to be molded into a self-made tech prodigy. She had spent weeks scouting for a man with no ties to her world, someone whose desperation would ensure his silence and whose integrity would make the performance believable. Elias listened, a bitter laugh bubbling in his chest. He looked at the woman who was offering him a fortune to play a game of dress-up while he was wondering if he could afford milk the next morning. The absurdity of the class divide was laid bare in the flickering light of the garage. Elena offered him a sum of money that would not only clear his debts, but buy him a house in a neighborhood where the air was clean enough for Mia to breathe without a nebulizer. It was a king's ransom for a peasant's weekend. Elena watched him, her expression a mask of corporate indifference, yet she didn't look away from his grease-smudged face. She saw the "single dad" written in the way he stood protectively in front of Mia's milk crate. She wasn't just buying a boyfriend, she was buying his dignity. "Why me?" Elias finally asked, his voice gravelly from years of breathing in exhaust fumes. Elena stepped closer, the scent of her expensive perfume clashing violently with the smell of gasoline. She told him that she needed someone who knew how to fight for something, someone whose eyes didn't look like the vacant, pampered heirs she grew up with. She needed a man who looked like he had built something with his own two hands, even if the story they would tell was a lie. As the rain reached the crescendo, Elias looked back at his daughter, who had fallen asleep against a stack of tires, her small hands still clutching the red crayon. He realized that in this world, pride was a luxury he could no longer afford. He picked up the silver pen Elena offered, his hand steady despite the exhaustion vibrating in his bones, and signed the contract that would turn his life into a high-stakes charade. The deal was struck. 1 weekend, 1 lie, and a lifetime of security. Beginning a journey that would force a king of the streets and a queen of the boardroom to find out what truly lay beneath the surface of their worlds. The transition from the gritty reality of the garage to the sterile, suffocating luxury of Elena's penthouse was a violent assault on Elias's senses. The elevator opened directly into a sprawling living space where the walls were made of glass and the floors were polished white marble that felt as cold as a frozen lake. For the next 48 hours, this was his training ground, a gilded cage where his rough edges were to be sanded down by a team of specialists who treated him more like a restoration project than a human being. The smell of sawdust and old oil was replaced by the scent of ozone and expensive cologne as he was scrubbed, trimmed, and tailored. A master tailor with a measuring tape draped like a snake around his neck moved with clinical efficiency, pinning a charcoal gray wool suit to Elias's frame. The fabric felt unnervingly light, a stark contrast to the heavy denim and canvas he had worn his entire life. When he looked into the floor-to-ceiling mirror, he didn't see the man who spent his nights worrying about the rent. He saw a ghost of a life he never wanted, a man who looked like he belonged in a boardroom but felt like a fraud in his own skin. Elena was a relentless drill sergeant, her heels clicking a rhythmic, demanding beat across the marble as she paced in front of him. She didn't just want him to look the part, she needed him to inhabit a history that wasn't his. She fed him names of imaginary venture capitalists, the nuances of bridge round financing, and the complex genealogy of her family's rivals. They spent hours sitting across from one another at a dining table that could seat 20. Practicing the choreography of high society etiquette. She taught him which fork to use for the chilled lobster and how to hold a crystal glass of aged scotch without looking like he was trying to choke it down. "Your hands, Elias," she snapped, her frustration boiling over during a rehearsal of their supposed meet-cute at a charity polo match. She reached out, grasping his hand to adjust his grip on a fountain pen. Her skin was soft, untouched by manual labor, and for a moment, the rehearsed coldness between them flickered. She felt the thick calluses on his palms, the physical evidence of a life spent building and breaking, and her lecture died in her throat. The silence that followed was heavy with a mutual, unspoken recognition. Elena pulled her hand away, clearing her throat as she looked out at the city lights. She admitted, in a voice that was uncharacteristically small, that she had spent her entire life surrounded by people who were polished to a mirror shine, but lacked any substance beneath the surface. She was terrified that her parents would see through the deception, not because Elias wasn't a good actor, but because he was too real for their world of shadows and mirrors. Elias watched her, noticing the way she rubbed her temples as if trying to massage away a permanent headache. He realized that for all her wealth, she lived in a state of constant performance, her every move choreographed to satisfy a board of directors or a disappointed father. In his world, if a machine broke, you fix it with your hands and a bit of sweat. In her world, everything was broken, but everyone pretended the engine was still humming perfectly. As the clock ticked toward midnight, the coaching session evolved into something more intimate than a business transaction. They sat on the plush velvet sofa, the folders of fake biographies discarded on the floor. Elias found himself sharing stories of his life before the debt took over, of his late wife's laughter, and the way Mia would only fall asleep if he hummed a specific, off-key tune. Elena, in turn, spoke of a childhood spent in boarding schools, where affection was measured in the size of a trust fund, and silence was the only language her parents truly understood. The tension that had defined their first meeting began to shift, moving from the friction of two opposing classes to the quiet gravity of two lonely souls. Elias saw the cracks in her porcelain exterior, the vulnerability she tried so desperately to hide behind her balance sheets. By the time the sun began to peek over the Atlantic, the makeover was complete. Elias Thorne looked like a millionaire, but as he stood there in his custom-tailored armor, he realized the greatest deception wasn't the lie they were telling her parents, it was the growing truth that he was starting to care about the woman who hired him to lie. The iron gates of the Sterling estate creaked open like the heavy jaws of a beast guarding a mountain of gold, revealing a sprawling Tudor mansion that seemed to loom over the landscape with an air of ancient, unearned superiority. As the sedan rolled up the long, winding driveway, Elias felt the charcoal wool of his suit tighten around his chest, not from a poor fit, but from the suffocating atmosphere of the estate. Elena sat beside him, her knuckles white as she gripped her designer clutch, her jaw set in a line so rigid it looked carved from marble. She had spent the last hour reminding him of her father's penchant for spotting weakness, yet as they stepped out into the crisp evening air, it was Elias who looked steady. He reached out, offering his arm with a quiet, grounded confidence that wasn't in the script. They were met at the door by Julian Sterling, a man whose presence felt like a sudden drop in temperature. His eyes, sharp and predatory behind gold-rimmed spectacles, didn't look at Elias, they dissected him, searching for the frayed edges of a story that hadn't been bought with a legacy. Dinner was served in a room where the ceilings were so high they seemed to swallow the light of the massive crystal chandeliers. Every clink of silver against fine bone china echoed like a gunshot in the oppressive silence. Julian led a relentless interrogation disguised as polite dinner conversation, throwing out obscure references to yachting circuits and Swiss banking regulations like traps laid in high grass. Elias navigated the minefield with a calm that seemed to frustrate the older man, answering with a calculated brevity that Elena had taught him, yet adding a layer of rugged sincerity that no amount of coaching could provide. However, the veneer of civility shattered when Julian turned his focus toward a local redevelopment project, scoffing at the entitled demands of the labor unions involved. He spoke of the working class as if they were a malfunctioning gear in a machine he owned, his voice dripping with a casual disdain that made the blood in Elias's veins turn to ice. Elena shifted uncomfortably, her eyes pleading with Elias to remain silent, to play the part of the agreeable elite she had paid him to be. But the silence in the room became too heavy to bear. Elias set his fork down, the sharp ring of the silver silencing Julian mid-sentence. Forgetting the fake tech mogul persona and the million-dollar contract, Elias looked Julian directly in the eye, his voice dropping into a low, resonant tone that commanded the room. He spoke not of spreadsheets or profit margins, but of the dignity of a man who works 12-hour shifts to keep the lights on, and the callous hands that actually built the world Julian looked down upon from his tower. He spoke with the raw authority of someone who had bled for his paycheck, dismantling Julian's elitist rhetoric with a quiet, undeniable truth about human worth. The table went deathly quiet. Elena's mother gasped, clutching her pearls as if the air itself had become polluted. But Elena didn't look away. She sat frozen, watching the man she had hired as a puppet become the only person in her life who had ever dared to stand up to the giant at the head of the table. The aftermath of the outburst felt like the static electricity before a lightning strike. Julian's face darkened to a deep, bruised purple, his eyes narrowing as he realized that the man sitting across from him couldn't be intimidated by wealth or status. The tension was broken only by the entrance of the waitstaff clearing the plates, a mechanical movement that felt absurd in the wake of such a primal confrontation. As they were excused to the parlor for brandy, Julian lingered behind, his gaze fixed on Elias's back with a newfound, dangerous curiosity. Elena led Elias toward the garden terrace, her hand trembling where it rested on his arm. When they were finally out of earshot of the house, she turned to him, her face a mask of conflicting emotions, terror at the potential ruin of her plan, but beneath it, a glowing spark of admiration she couldn't quite extinguish. She realized then that Elias wasn't just a character in her play. He was a force of nature that was systematically tearing down the walls of the world she had spent her whole life trying to survive. The deception was still intact, but the power dynamic had shifted forever. The mechanic from the streets had just taught the masters of the universe what it meant to have a spine. The velvet darkness of the Sterling Gardens offered a fleeting sanctuary from the suffocating judgment radiating within the manor stone walls. Moonlight spilled over the manicured hedges, casting long, skeletal shadows that seemed to mock the artificial perfection of the estate. Eleanor leaned against a stone balustrade, her silhouette sharp against the glowing windows of the parlor, while Elias stood a few paces back, the cool night air finally clearing the scent of expensive brandy and old arrogance from his lungs. The silence between them was no longer filled with the frantic mental rehearsals of a lie. Instead, it was heavy with the gravity of the truth he had spoken at the dinner table. Eleanor finally turned, her eyes shimmering with a mixture of exhaustion and a raw, newfound clarity. She didn't scold him for breaking character or for risking the multi-million-dollar stakes of her inheritance. Instead, she asked him, in a voice barely above a whisper, how he managed to carry such a quiet certainty in a world designed to make people feel small. Elias stepped closer, the gravel crunching beneath his polished shoes, a sound that felt far too grounded for such a ghostly place. He spoke of Mia, describing the way his daughter looked at him as if he were a giant, regardless of the balance in his bank account. He explained that when you have someone who relies on your strength to survive, you lose the ability to be intimidated by men who have never had to bleed for their dinner. As the night deepened, the roles they had meticulously crafted began to dissolve entirely, leaving behind two people stripped of their titles and their armor. Eleanor confessed the hollow reality of her success, admitting that she had spent her career building walls of gold just to keep from being crushed by the weight of her father's expectations. She spoke of the paralyzing fear that if she ever stopped moving, ever stopped succeeding, she would simply vanish into the shadows of the Sterling legacy. For the first time, she wasn't the Iron Queen of the boardroom. She was a woman who had forgotten the sound of her own voice until Elias had used his to defend the world she had been taught to despise. The performance had become a mirror, reflecting a life she no longer recognized. Elias watched her, seeing the brilliance and the burden she carried, and he realized that the loneliness of the 1% was its own kind of poverty. He reached out, his calloused thumb brushing a stray tear from her cheek, a gesture that wasn't in the script and carried no financial incentive. In that moment, the class divide that had seemed like a canyon just days ago felt like a narrow crack they could both jump over if they only had the courage to let go of the lies that protected them. Their shared solitude was shattered by the heavy thud of the terrace doors swinging open. Julian Sterling stepped out into the moonlight, his presence a dark blot against the elegance of the garden. He had been watching from the shadows, his eyes narrowed with a cold, calculating suspicion that reached far deeper than a simple dinner disagreement. He didn't come to argue, he came to reclaim his territory. He spoke to Eleanor as if she were a wayward asset, a piece of equipment that needed recalibration, and he looked at Elias with a look of pure, clinical observation, as if he were an invasive species that had wandered into a pristine ecosystem. He made a subtle, cutting remark about hired help knowing their place, a verbal jab intended to remind them both of the transaction that had brought them together. The air grew frigid, the warmth of their quiet connection evaporating under the heat of Julian's scrutiny. Eleanor's hand went cold against the stone, her old instincts for survival warring with the pride Elias had sparked within her. As they were led back into the house, the mask began to slip, not because of a mistake in the story, but because the truth was becoming too large to contain. The weekend wasn't just a social experiment anymore. It had become a battle for the soul of a woman who was realizing that the man she had hired to fool her world was the only one who had ever truly seen her. The final morning at the Sterling estate arrived with a deceptive stillness, the sun rising over the manicured lawns in a wash of pale gold that did little to warm the frigid atmosphere inside the breakfast room. The climax of the charade was no longer a looming threat, but a present reality, triggered by a private investigator's report that Julian Sterling laid onto the mahogany table with the clinical precision of a man delivering a death sentence. The photos were grainy but unmistakable. Elias in his grease-stained coveralls, Elias holding Mia outside their dilapidated garage, and the signed contract that outlined the financial terms of their deception. Julian didn't shout. His voice was a low, terrifying rumble as he gave Elena an ultimatum that carried the weight of her entire future. Disavow the mechanic, admit the fraud, and marry the hand-picked suitor of his choosing, or be stripped of her title and legacy by noon. Elena stood at the edge of the abyss she had feared her entire life, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She looked at her father, a man who viewed human relationships as mergers and acquisitions. And then she looked at Elias, who stood by the window, his posture unyielding even as the world they had built out of lies crumbled around them. The silence in the room was a living thing, suffocating and thick, until Elena finally found the voice she had been searching for since her childhood. She didn't offer an apology or a plea for mercy. Instead, she walked to the table and picked up the investigative report, tearing it slowly in half as she looked her father in the eye with a terrifyingly calm resolve. She told him that while the story of Elias's background was a fabrication, the man he was, the integrity he possessed, and the courage he showed in the face of Julian's tyranny was the only authentic thing she had ever encountered in the Sterling house. She officially resigned her position, walking away from the glass towers and the billions in inheritance, choosing the uncertainty of a life built on truth over the gilded prison of her father's approval. Julian's face paled, the realization hitting him that for the first time in his life, his wealth was a useless weapon against someone who had finally learned their own worth. Elena turned to Elias, her eyes bright with a mixture of fear and liberation, and for the first time she wasn't looking at a business partner, she was looking at her future. Outside the iron gates, away from the watchful eyes of the Sterling dynasty, the air felt lighter, charged with the electricity of a new beginning. Elena reached into her bag and pulled out the final payment check, a sum that would have secured Elias's shop and Mia's health for decades to come. She handed it to him, her hand trembling slightly as she thanked him for being the catalyst of her awakening. Elias looked at the paper, the ink representing the very reason he entered into the lion's den. And then he looked at the woman who had just sacrificed everything to stand beside him. With a slow, deliberate motion, he handed the check back to her. He told her that he had signed up to save his daughter's life, but he wouldn't do it by taking the last of what Elena had left of her independence. He had realized during the long nights of rehearsal and the battle in the dining room that his character wasn't for sale, and he wouldn't let their connection be defined by a transaction anymore. He had enough in his savings to get by, and more importantly, he had his dignity back, a commodity that Julian Sterling couldn't price. The story concluded not with a grand celebration in a ballroom, but with a quiet walk toward Elias's old sedan, which looked like a battered relic against the backdrop of the estate. As they drove away from the Sterling legacy, the class divide that had once seemed like an impassable ocean felt like nothing more than a memory. They weren't a CEO and a mechanic anymore. They were two people who had stripped away the societal labels to reveal a shared, common humanity. Elena realized that while she had lost a fortune, she had gained a soul. And Elias realized that being a hero didn't mean having a bank account full of money. It meant having the strength to walk away from it when the cost was too high. As they reached the city limits, the skyline ahead no longer looked like a collection of glass cages, but a landscape of infinite possibilities. They had started with a total deception, but in the wreckage of their lies, they found the most authentic connection of their lives, proving that true worth is never found in what you own, but in who you are willing to become for the people you love.